And welcome to the African American Genealogy Society Fort Wayne and our monthly workshop. I'm Al Brothers. I'm the Vice President of the Society. And at this point in time, I'd like to get started here. Our topic today is immigration, naturalization, and travel. And our agenda is this. Really, it's a two-part. One talking about immigration, navigation, naturalization to travel. And the second part will be a case study, particularly from my family itself. Now, as we look at immigration and naturalization, we've got a couple of questions. What is the history of U.S. immigration and naturalization? How are they defined? What is immigration and the African-American experience? Now, talking about the history of immigration and naturalization, if you take a look between 1776 and 1790, it was open-ended. Each state established its laws, procedures, and residency requirements for aliens to become naturalized citizens. The case that we need to understand is that Great Britain began, I should say the United States began regulating immigration soon after winning independence. And the first was the 1790 Naturalization Act. And this act excluded non-white people from eligibility to naturalize. And the naturalization requirements included 2 years of residency in the country and good moral character. The Naturalization Act of 1795 extended the requirement to 5 years. And in 98, this was extended further to 14 years. Then in 1802, it went back to 5 years. Now, starting in 1875, a series of restrictions on immigration were enacted. We'll talk a little bit about that. A key factor for many of us who have African heritage, in 1870, the right of citizenship was extended to those of African origin. And by the early 1900s, the nation's predominant immigration flow shifted away from Northern and Western European countries to the Southern and Eastern Europe portions of Europe itself. Now, longstanding immigration restrictions began to crumble in 1943 when a law allowed a limited number of Chinese to immigrate. In 1965, through a combination of political, social, and geopolitical factors, there was a passage of the landmark Immigration and Nationality Act that created a new system, and it favored family reunification and skilled immigrants rather than country quotas. Now, just the last thing here before we head out. In 1986, Congress enacted another major law, the Immigration Reform and Control Act, and that granted legalization to millions of unauthorized immigrants, mainly from Latin America, who met certain conditions. Immigration, let's take a look and see what this is, what this means. It's talking about the act of leaving one's home country and moving to another country of which we're not native or citizens, with the intention to settle or reside there, particularly as permanent residents or naturalized citizens. Another factor in immigration is to take up employment as a migrant worker or temporarily as a foreign worker. Now, in the United States Immigration and Nationality Act, an immigrant is an individual seeking to become a permanent, lawful resident. Naturalization. Now, it's the process by which a U.S. citizenship is granted to a lawful permanent resident after meeting the requirements established by Congress. Now, an example of this is acquisition of citizenship through the U.S. citizenship of your parents, either at birth or after birth, but before the age of 18. Immigration. This is one you tend not to hear much about. So when people leave their own country to settle permanently in another, they are called migrants or immigrants. And from the perspective of the country they leave, they are called immigrant or out-migrant. Now, what about the African American, I'll use the term African heritage, you'll see why. Remember that slavery did bring people here legally from the country standpoint and illegally, but not as citizens. Now, what about our heritage? Remember, people came here later on from outside countries. They've come from Africa, the Caribbean islands, Europe, and Canada. Many folks from Africa migrated to a country other than their home country, example in Europe or other places, or Canada, and then came to the United States. Now, how do we know about travel records? Now, these are the key facets for travel. A key one for us is passenger lists. And most of those were, at the time that we're talking about, ship lists. Then there were crew lists. The crew lists were listing the members of a respective ship's crew. There are also border crossing records. An example would be from Mexico into the United States or from Canada into the United States. Another passport that we all are familiar with are passports. Passports are a key facet as we travel throughout the world. Now, how do African Americans differ within our country? What kind of documents did they have to have? Because remember, traveling within the country typically did not require documentation. Or so let's look at passports. They evolved in England in the 1400s and were provided by a king or potentate or a specific government entity. They were first letters of introduction. And again, the most famous US passports were issued by Benjamin Franklin when he was in France in the late 1780s. And these early versions were more like reference letters than a mode of identification. They were letters of introduction that verified the character of the person bearing them. And 9 times out of 10, they were for women. I mean, for men, not women. Women typically didn't travel like that. Now, the formal documents that we recognize as passports started about 1914 in World War I. It was the wake of the First World War that those documents occurred as we know it today. Suddenly what happens is European countries want to know who's crossing their borders. And the US follows suit, requiring passports with a photo in late 1914. Now, this is an early passport, a US passport from 1915, when the document was actually a paper document. And again, you'll see up here in the left-hand side of the picture, and then all of the information about the individual on the paper itself. So it was an actual paper document. Now, what about in-country movement for African Americans? In some areas, masters hired out their skilled slaves outside the plantation. And when they traveled off plantation, they were required to travel with a tag, like a dog tag, or a pass. And here below here, shown here, is an example pass. And again, given to in the June 1st, 1848 to Benjamin McDaniel. So they were people who were enslaved, who traveled from one place to another, were supposed to carry a pass signed by their owner. And again, if you didn't have it, you could be arrested, jailed, and detained as a runaway. And some owners actually wrote a general pass, so they didn't have to write a pass every time their respective slave went off the plantation to work someplace. And again, as was mentioned, Benjamin, this pass allowed Benjamin to travel to a market in Shenandoah County, Virginia. And it's dated in 1 January, 1843. And it included the destination as well as the specific day on which he was to return. Now, this is an example. I'll talk about, 1930. You'll see why a little bit why I talk about 1930. Now, notice the difference. It was no longer a paper passport. It, in fact, had a cover. And inside, again, it had the picture of the individual and information. As you move to our current passport examples, and this is what I carry today, again, you have the same picture, more information, again, the cover, but there's something different now. You have a current passport card, particularly to go either into Mexico or into Canada. And again, it's just like the driver's license, except it is a passport mechanism. Immigration. When immigrating to the US, there are four categories: citizens, residents, non-immigrants, and undocumented immigrants. So again, that kind of immigration falls into 4 categories. And starting in 1875, we're talking about restrictions, a series of restrictions were enacted. They included bans on criminals, people with contagious diseases, polygamists, anarchists, beggars, and importers of prostitutes, and other restrictions targeted the rising number of Asian immigrants, first limiting the migration from China and later banning immigration from most Asian countries. So again, country restrictions, and again, health still exist. Iraq, Iran, and any country that we had military conflicts with, there may be a restriction. And another key facet that still is in place are the health and background checks. Even when you file today for, again, for naturalization and immigration concerns, there's a health and also a background check. Now, what kind of documents for immigration are there? Immigration visas. We talked about passports, and many countries have passports, but other countries require visas, an actual visa to get in. There are also ship logs and U.S. entry forms. When I flew overseas and came back, I had to fill out an entry form describing who I was, again, proving that I was a U.S. citizen and where was I going. When we talk about immigration and the time frame particularly, there are major immigration entry points. There were 5 major ports between the 19th and early 20th centuries. Again, Baltimore, my hometown of Boston, New Orleans, New York, and Philadelphia. Those were the key entry points. But you have to remember that ships carrying people unloaded at 90 other ports on the Atlantic, Pacific, and Gulf Coast, as well as in the Great Lakes. So again, people entered in Detroit, Galveston, Texas, Gloucester, New Bedford, Mass, Gulfport, and Pascagoula, Mississippi, Key West, Florida, Portland, Maine, Providence, Rhode Island, San Francisco, Savannah, Georgia, and Seattle, Washington, among other locations. Let's talk about naturalization and citizenship in these ways. Talk about naturalization methods, the documents. What is a certificate of citizenship? What are the requirements for citizenship and how do you apply? Let's also talk about women in citizenship and non-U.S. citizens and how they gain their citizenship through participating in the U.S. military. Now, a certificate of citizenship is a document proving you are a U.S. citizen, and it's generally issued to derived citizens, to persons who acquire U.S. citizenship. We talk about derivation of citizenship, and it's common for permanent resident children whose parents are naturalized. When certain requirements are met, the children automatically become a U.S. citizen. So again, if the parents immigrated here with their children, the parents became citizens, the children would subsequently become citizens. Then there's the acquisition of citizenship when a child is born outside the United States, provided one of the parents is a U.S. citizen. And this certificate is different than a certificate of naturalization. I mention this because we have companies who have, again, locations overseas. They'll send many of their people overseas to live for a while and work there. Children are born there. So the children have to obtain their citizenship through one U.S. parent. The other one is, again, soldiers outside the United States, being stationed outside the United States with their families. They may be born, the kids may be born in a different country. Again, they acquire their citizenship because their parents are citizens in that sense. So again, this is how the two primary ways of obtaining citizenship. And a person would obtain citizenship by filing a form N-600, and it's called an application for certificate of citizenship. Now, this is an example. So it gives you an example, again, a picture, information about the individual with a respective number. So again, this is an example of citizenship, a certificate of citizenship. I mentioned before naturalization. Now, prior to September 27th, 1906, and here's the key, any court of record, and that meant municipal, county, state, or federal, could grant U.S. citizenship. And often people who are applying for citizenship went to the court most geographically advantageous for them. So again, if I lived in Massachusetts, I'd go to Boston, for example. Now, beginning September 27th, 1906, the naturalization process became a two-step process that took a minimum of 5 years. First, after residing in the United States for 2 years, an alien could file a declaration of intention, which were called first papers, to become a citizen. After 3 additional years, the alien could petition for naturalization, which are called second papers. And after petition was granted, a certificate of citizenship was issued to the new citizen. Naturalization documents, okay? We mentioned about a declaration of intent, an actual piece of paper that's signed that says, I intend to become a U.S. citizen. Then there's a petition for naturalization, saying I want to become a naturalized U.S. citizen. Then there's a certificate of naturalization, and it's one of the most important records, immigration records, and found typically in U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services historic files, C files, because the certificate of naturalization helps protect naturalized citizens, naturalized people, their rights as U.S. citizens, and it helps the U.S. government protect itself from false claims to American citizenship. When we talk about the certificate file, every person naturalized between September 27, 1906 and March 31st, 1956 as a certificate file or C file with the United States Service containing a copy of their certificate of naturalization. Now the forms change. The form 2207 without a photo was issued between 1906 and June 30th of 1929. The form 2207 with a photo was issued between July 1st, 1929 and January 12th, 1941. The form N550 was issued between January 13th, 1941 and March 35th, 1956. I'm covering, again, looking at our ancestors, not current facets right now. And here are some examples. On the left-hand side, a certificate of naturalization. And on the right-hand side, you notice it says up here, duplicate. It's in the C file. It's a C file document. This is the one that's filed with the Naturalization Service. So again, there are 2 different documents, but again, you may find them in the records of your ancestors, or you can find them actually physically in different locations in the country. Now, what are the requirements to become a U.S. citizen? Okay, had to be at least 18 years of age when you file, have been a lawful permanent resident for the past 3 or 5 years, and that depends upon the category you're applying under, have continuous residence and physical presence in the United States, be able to read, write, and speak basic English. When I was growing up in Boston, this was a key facet because we had people coming in from Italy who couldn't speak English, the grandparents. They never became U.S. citizens because they could not meet that particular goal. You have to demonstrate good moral character, demonstrate a knowledge and understanding of U.S. history and government. Unfortunately, many of U.S. citizens can't do that themselves right now, I'm afraid. Demonstrate a loyalty to the principles of the U.S. Constitution and be willing to take an oath of allegiance. Today, as I mentioned, filing can be done electronically or by paper, but the service itself will follow in both cases with you to continue that process. I mentioned women in citizenship. This is a key facet early on because women could lose their citizenship if they marry an alien or non-citizen. In March of 1907, Congress passed the Expiation Act, which decreed, among other things, that U.S. women who married non-citizens were no longer Americans. If their husbands later became a naturalized citizen, they could go again through the naturalization process to regain their citizenship. Well, the Cable Act of 1922, also known as the Married Women's Independent Nationality Act, said women kept their citizenship if they married a man who could become a citizen, even if he opted not to, which meant he had to have good moral character, the whole gamut, not have a bad record or anything else. The key thing is these expatriated women had to petition the government to regain their citizenship, and their husband's status still played a role in theirs. If he wasn't eligible for citizenship, she, in fact, could be denied. And if she lived on foreign soil for 2 years, she could lose again her citizenship. But in the 40s, attitudes and laws evolved, and women born in the US no longer had to limit their marriage prospects to native-born men or naturalized citizens. Now, this was a big one in relative to the military. Non-citizens in the US military. A key thing is, since the Revolutionary War, legal permanent residents are eligible to enlist in the military. And roughly 35,000 non-citizens are serving in active duty today, and about 8,000 join each year. So again, most of these folks are in roles that do not require and are enlisted and do not require security clearances, because they can't get a security clearance. And again, the key facet for them is the time to process the application is much faster for troops than civilians, because the Department of Defense and the US Citizenship and Immigration Services have a memorandum of agreement to expedite that military application. And if they don't receive their citizenship during their first enlistment, they will not be allowed to reenlist. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the records here. We talked about ship lists. We talked about the immigration visas. We'll talk about green cards. In the naturalization process, we talk about applications or affidavits, hearings and tests, and final determination. These are the processes that you have to go through. Now, when you take a look at example records, we talked about the ship list, visas, and green cards, but there are others, and also the application, hearings and tests, and final determination. And by the way, the hearings were in fact in a court, not in a lawyer's office. But there are other. Bank records can give you insights, because again, you're required to declare whether you're a U.S. citizen or not when you open up a bank account. You may not realize that, but that's the case. Employment records, again, if you're employed, your employer is also required to identify people who are U.S. citizens and who are not U.S. citizens. Military records the same way. Again, we talked about how we have people who are legal permanent residents who, in fact, would be in the military, and the military records were so defined where they were born and so forth. Now, what about proof of citizenship? A couple. A fully valid, undamaged U.S. passport is a proof, and it can be expired. So again, in that context, because it is a true legal document, U.S. birth certificates, okay, have to be issued in the United States itself. Census records, if you're in, you and your family are located in the census records, again, every 10 years, that is a proof that you've been here in the United States for that particular period of time. State and local records, including school records, again, for your kids. Your kids go through school, they're registered for school, they go through the school each and every year, records are maintained on them. That is a proof of citizenship. Hospital and doctor's records. Again, you've got to, again, provide information to the hospital and doctor about your background. And if you're a non-citizen, you must so state. And the last one I like is one, because again, this has been a problem in many families when children never had a birth certificate. The family Bible was a way of proving that you were born in the United States and were in fact a U.S. citizen. We talked about visas. And again, some countries require it and some don't in terms of travel visas. Well, let's take a look. There are actually 4 types of visas. And the most current one, the most popular one, or one most often used, is the tourist visa. When you go to a particular country and you're going there as a tourist, you have a type 1 visa. The second, type 2, is an immigration and naturalization visa. It includes folks by marriage. And again, it's showing that you intend to come to the United States, to immigrate and become a naturalized citizen. Type 3, again, here in Fort Wayne and other places where the colleges and universities exist, Students from abroad come over here, again, to study for a year or more. And again, they get student visas. And type 4 are business or work visas, and they include both non-immigrant and immigrant types. So again, a person could come in here with a particular specialty, work for a particular period of time, and head back home. Now, where do you find information on them, your ancestors? Again, one way is Ancestry.com. Again, these are digital. FamilySearch is another way. Again, digital. Government sites, an example is the Citizenship Naturalization website, again, listed here. But as we try to find information, there's a couple of keys. One key is knowing the time frame your ancestor came to the U.S. Remember I mentioned that before. And the reason is because the law is different at different time frames. Another is knowing their name during the process of immigration to naturalization or permanent residency. My grandfather's name, and I'll usually say he came from Canada, was Lewis Owen Brothers. But again, we knew everyone who called him Oni. I never knew his first name was Lewis for quite a while because everyone called him Oni, but that was not his name. So again, if I try to find Oni Brothers, he wouldn't exist. So again, if I can find Lewis or Owen Brothers, I can find him. Now, where else can you find him? You can come here to the Allen County Genealogy Center, look at the books and microfilm and talk to the great staff here and help you, again, better understand that process. You can go to a Family History Center or to Utah, and again, look through the books and microfilm and other history information relative to people who came from certain countries. And it may give you some insight in terms of how your people came here and where they entered. I mentioned on numerous entry points. Someone, for example, enters in New York City, Ellis Island, but they reside in Minnesota. But again, they came in one place, but resided someplace else. So you, as an answer, saying, okay, where did they come in? Again, did they come in Minnesota? But there's no place in Minnesota for them to come in. How did they get here? Was it really Ellis Island? Was it Boston? Was it someplace else? The time period would help tell you that information. And the History Center and Allen County Genealogy Center can help you in that determination. But there are other places to look. State and local archives. Why do I say state and local archives? Remember I mentioned at one point, people could file for the naturalization at any court in their respective state. It could be local, it could be county, it could be a state court, it could be a federal court. They can apply any place. And so again, knowing when they came in helps narrow down your search focus. And again, I found out there are many times original documents in those state and local archives. There are also national archives. And again, original documents are in fact still maintained there. Some of them are in fact electronically, again, available. But again, the original documents are there. Here's a term you hear quite often, at least I do. The term is resident alien. And what is it? It's a permanent resident or lawful permanent resident, which means they are considered an immigrant who has been legally and lawfully recorded as a resident of this country. And that resident must have a green card or pass a substantial presence test, meaning how long have you been in the country? I want to point out, even with a green card, a person who spends 31 days in the United States during the current year and 183 days during a 3-year period, and that includes the current year, and 2 years immediately before that is considered, I'll use the term resident alien. You have to document it. So how can you find information about that? What do you need to know? An example, census records. My great-grandfather, George and Melissa Brothers, and my grandfather, Lewis Owen Brothers, show up in the census. Again, they immigrated to the United States from Canada around 1905 to 1907. And again, they're in the census data from, again, 1910, 1920, 1930. My great-grandfather died in 1932. 1940, and my great-grandmother died in 1946. but their son was continuous all the way through because he didn't pass away until 1986. Government websites. And again, those websites will provide you greater information. And again, we talked about documents. One thing you tend to hear about quite often are green cards. The green card is really a permanent resident card and allows you to live and work permanently in the United States. And those folks who immigrate to the United States are all vying for a green card. They never have been given that name officially, but it took the nickname after these cards were first introduced in 1950. Remember the year 1950, as a result of the Alien Registration Act 10 years prior in 1940. So again, the key term here is a green card. So if you're going to work here legally in the United States, and again, you're not a true citizen, you have to be able to show a green card in order to get a job. Let's talk about my family, okay? Talk a little bit about my genealogy to my great-grandfather, George William Brothers. Then you have my grandfather, Lewis Owen Brothers, and his wife, and I'm going to point out Elsie, Eveline, Martha, Monroe, and of course, brothers. I never knew her first two names were Elsie, Eveline. I only knew her as Martha, or my grandfather called her Ev, and I couldn't figure out where that name Ev came from. But again, once I looked at her birth certificate, I finally figured out what it was. And we'll talk about the document naturalization process and alien registry relative to them. This is my paternal father, my grandfather, Lewis Owen Brothers. This is my paternal grandmother, Elsie, Eveline, Martha. There was another name in there which I didn't realize, Lawrence Monroe. She had a whole bunch of names on her birth certificate. The name Lawrence came from the family her mother worked for. So again, in that sense. Now let's talk about my family. We go back to my fourth great grandfather, Samuel Brothers, who was born in 1758 in Virginia. He did die in 1822 in Nova Scotia, Canada. He emigrated to Canada in 1783 from New York during the Revolutionary War. So again, we have that documentation that he in fact made that trip. And his name and his wife and two children are listed in the Book of Negroes. If you've ever remember that story, he's listed there. His son, George Henry Brothers, was born in 1785 in Nova Scotia, and he died in 1850 in Nova Scotia. George N. Brothers was born in 1813 in Nova Scotia and died in 1880 in Nova Scotia. Then we come to my great-grandfather, born in 1859 in Nova Scotia, but he died in 1942 in Oaks Bluff, Massachusetts, down on Cape Cod. He immigrated to the United States in 1908. How do we know that? It's on the census data. The census records, and in fact, when you talk about people from coming here from a foreign country, they ask what year did they enter the country. Then the last one is my grandfather, Lewis Owen Brothers, who was born in 1885 in Nova Scotia and died in 1983 in Boston, Mass. And he immigrated to the US in 1908. We'll talk a little bit about those dates. Now let's go back through here again a little bit. Now, my grandfather immigrated multiple dates, 1907, 1904, and again, as it is registered in the 1920 census, the problem was, can you read the census effectively? Realistic, because remember, that document had a whole bunch of different dates, writing as far as that goes. He married my grandmother in 1912, and again, that's documented on a Massachusetts marriage certificate. He filed naturalization papers, and that's listed in the 1920 federal census. He had an application hearing for registration that was approved September 24th, 1925. They claimed he was naturalized in the 1930 census, but notice that the immigration year here listed was 1905. And then in the 1940 census, it says he was naturalized, a naturalized citizen. Yeah. 29. Okay.
Hey, Dr. Brothers, if there
Yes.
is a question, will you repeat it for the people on Zoom? We can't hear the people in the room.
Okay. The question was the date 1929 or 1925? And the documents will show it here. Now, this is the Declaration of Intent. And again, my grandfather is on the left-hand side, another gentleman's on the right-hand side. It has, and again, this was filed to show that he had an intent to become a U.S. citizen. Now, this is the naturalization record for him. And again, he lived right around the street from where I knew him, that he lived. Again, it gave his age, the date order of admission, 1932, the date the certificate was issued, and where? U.S. District Court in Boston, Mass. So again, this provides me information relative to when he became a truly naturalized citizen. Let me go back here because I need to show you, again, other documents from my grandfather. And it's interesting because when you see what I'm looking at, I'm pulling up Ancestry, okay? And what I'm gonna do here is do the search for my grandfather. And I'm gonna do it. You notice that under search, you have all collection, census and voter list, birth, marriage, and death, but you also have immigration and travel records. And again, that's what I'm gonna look for. Okay. It's nice that it fills it in for me since I've done it quite a bit here. Now, what you can do here, he, for a good portion of his career, worked on steamship lines, okay, as a crew member and as a cook. So what I'm gonna do here now is actually go to the crew list itself. And just do an all search. So I want to show you what in fact shows up here. Now it says L.O. Brothers, and it talks about his birth 1884, arrival 1918 Boston, Mass. Remember, this is a crew list. Now, if I look at the one here in the middle shows, again, it's pulled off. I'll show you the other one of the actual list itself. He gives his name, L.O. Brothers, his age, birth date, birthplace, the arrival date, the arrival place, Boston, Mass., and the ship, the Governor Cobb. So again, it shows you that, again, he was working. So again, when it came back in, that's what it looked like. First, go to the top up here. Now, this is a crew list, okay? Governor Cobb of Boston, Mass., bound for Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, and it came back, okay? And it talks about the name, residency, capacity, birth date, personal description. And so let me get out of my grandfather here. Okay, here he is. Lewis Owen Brothers. Again, we're talking about Boston, kitchen man. And again, he was born in Canada. Again, he lives in the United States. He's 34 years old. He's 5'4". He's colored. And again, so again, this is a way of keeping track of people in terms of how they were identified. So again, these are actually the crew lists associated with it. Let's go back one more and pick up another one. See, go ahead. Ditto. They asked, the question was, what does DO mean? DO means ditto. It's just the same. But again, you can see all the records here were from 1918. So he did quite a bit of travel there in 1918. Let me move now to FamilySearch again. In this case here, I'll do the same thing, putting in his name. Okay. And birthplace, Nova Scotia. And birth year, I'll put 1881. I know he was born in 1884 to 1886. And I'm going to do it with his father. I could do it with his wife, but realize when he first came in, he wasn't married. So therefore, I'm trying to capture other records as well. And I'm not going to restrict the records by country or anything else, because in case he traveled overseas, you know, in that sense too. Okay. It's interesting when we look at here, it talks about, again, the birth of his son and other members, and they can't spell. His father's name was George. His mother's name was Melissa. So we talk about, you know, about misspellings and everything else. It gives you a hint, folks. Sometimes it doesn't come up that way. Okay. Now this, I wanted the true list on here. Give an indication. Now here again is age, immigration date, immigration, Suffolk, Mass, place, ship, name, the Yarmouth. Okay. So, but the key here is really looking at what the document says. And again, the first one we saw was 1918. This one is Yarmouth arriving at Boston, Mass, December 2nd, 1931, from Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. And again, similar indications about names, the length of service at sea, which is different, position in the Navy, in the ship's company, ship or engaged, where, when and where. And again, there are a whole host of other things, again, talking about age and whether they're able to read, also discussing height, weight, and everything else. Now let's see what it says about my grandfather at this time. Okay, here it is. And again, notice the signature, this case of a ship's officer relative to this manifesto list. Okay. Again, it talks about 22 years in the company. He was a chef. He was a chef for a good number of years. Again, the date. Let's see, what is age? Canadians born in Canada. And again, it talked about his height and his weight. So again, I just want to show you the difference about crew lists. The passenger lists are the same way. When you come, as I mentioned, when you come to the United States from overseas, again, you have to fill out a form as well. Now to my grandmother, with the 4 first names here, whatever it is as far as that goes. Again, she was born in 1893 in Pepperell, Mass. She married my grandfather in 1912. So obviously when she married him, she lost her citizenship. 1920 census, no mention of naturalization status or citizenship status. That question was never asked on the form, on either 1920, 1930, or 1940 form. I just happen to know, again, she didn't have citizenship at that time. She filed a petition to regain her citizenship in 1941. So again, in theory, she was a resident alien at that point in time. She signed an oath to regain her citizenship, and then she passed away in in 1989, Jamaica Plain, Mass, which is just outside of Boston. She had to file a petition to regain her U.S. citizenship. And this is the petition that she had to sign. And I have the original copy. And then, as that process unfolded, there was an information request for her relative to her status. They wanted a birth certificate and a marriage certificate. So again, those, out of all the listing of things, those are the two things they wanted, okay? Then she had to sign an oath to regain her citizenship. So she signed it and regained her citizenship in 1941. So as you look back over what we discussed, we talked a little about immigration, naturalization, citizenship, travel records, how to do some searches. We had a case study relative to my own family, you know, in that sense, to give you an indication of how things occur in different families. Again, you may have people coming from Canada, you may have people coming from Africa, you may have relatives who came from the Caribbean or other places as far as that goes. And again, these are the methodologies by which you do the search. But one of the keys is remember to check the time frame for your ancestors' immigration, naturalization, citizenship, and travel. That time frame is critical because the laws differ over the time. I do recommend you ask your family about its history and when ancestors arrived in the US and from where. I want to add also, and how, because it could be they started, for example, in Europe, came in Africa, Europe, then came to Canada, then came to the United States. So again, this family history is critical as you try to do your research. And a key question is, what country did they depart from? And maybe is the port known? We have a gentleman in our group who's asking about England. And again, yes, the entry points here in the United States would list the country from which they came. And again, if it's the United Kingdom, they would list that also. The ship's manifest would also indicate where that ship came from or departed from. So again, it could be Portsmouth, you know, England. It could be any port in England. So that would be the starting point for you to try to check records in England relative or another country relative to your relative and where they lived. You then also look again at the U.S. Census records because they will indicate the country from which they came and also the year in which they immigrated. So again, those are the key things relative to this kind of study. I've talked quite a bit here, and I'm opening up for questions here. Any questions? You've been hit with quite a bit of information here, and this is a literal top view. I didn't bring it completely up to date. Again, about the process that people go through today. But again, it's a very, very similar process. The laws are, as I pointed out, do favor families and employment at this point in time. And again, over the last couple of years, immigration has slowed, you know, in that situation, you know, to the United States. So again, it'll depend upon, as I say, the time frame in which your ancestors traveled. And again, you can even check yourself if you travel overseas, as I have. Again, I've got passports and passport records, you know, to indicate where I went in the whole 9 yards. It was interesting coming back in, again, to have to file that record. It was also interesting when I went for my last trip to Germany, through Iceland into Germany, and the kind of records or forms I had to fill out to actually go to those particular countries. I guess I changed airplanes in Iceland, because I went from Chicago to Iceland and then to Hamburg, Germany. But I didn't have to fill in any forms when I got into Iceland because I was actually exiting the country. But I did have to fill out a form when I went to Germany. So again, each country has its own forms and ways of doing things. Please go ahead. The question was, is there a requirement to be able to speak English coming into the United States? The answer is no, you don't have to. As a matter of fact, the only English speaking requirement would be when you apply for citizenship. So again, and that's why early on people had difficulty because particularly more senior citizens, they had difficulty learning the language, and they remain resident aliens. You know, but their kids could become citizens. Yep. Oh yes, there was a requirement. You know, and be honest about it. Yes, we try to allow people to, for example, fill out forms in different languages. But in theory, you're supposed to be able to speak limited English of some way before you go, or before you actually become a U.S. citizen. And it's an interesting, you know, dynamic as far as that goes. Just a quick point of information here. Our next workshop is going to be Saturday, October 16th, and the topic will be cemetery research. And I do know we do have a new member on, our Aretha Smith. Again, if you want to tell us a little bit about what you're searching for, that would be fantastic.
Hi, are you able to hear me?
Oh, yes, I can. Yep.
Okay. My mother is from Nassau, Bahamas. Her dad was born in Barbados.
Uh-huh.
He immigrated to Haiti and Jamaica, ended up in Nassau, where he met my grandmother,
Okay.
who was born in Andros, but I don't know how they both ended up in Nassau. That's where they met and raised their family.
Okay.
And I haven't actually started the research on maternal side of the family, but with you giving these tips and information on naturalization and finding that, I want to start looking back on this side of the family. But my mother and father met in missionary school in Nashville, Tennessee.
Oh, okay.
And then got married in Nassau at their Bethel Baptist Church there. And she got her citizenship, must have been in the 60s. Now I'd like to find that document now that you brought that up. I want to find that. And because I can remember, even though I was small, I remember her going for her citizenship.
Sure.
And I was upset because I couldn't go with her.
Sure.
And they got married there. And just a little mention, when I met my husband here, I wanted to get married in the same church my mom and dad did. And I found the actual newspaper article where they got married on September 1st in 1948.
Oh, wow.
And
Okay.
it was published in the Nassau, Bahamas. I think it was called The Voice.
Okay.
September 4th, 1948. But that's how I found out the church and everything. And so I told my husband the only way I'd marry him is if he go back to Nassau and get married in the church my parents were married in, and that's what we did.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, I want to do more research or start research on that side. I've done a little bit of research on my father's side, the Bankses, and all the way back. They're from Germany, came to Pennsylvania, somehow came to Kentucky, and that's where I've found the most information, in Henderson County and Shelby County, Kentucky. He was born in Frankfort in 1916 and lived in Nashville, Kentucky.
Okay.
And grew up there, and then went to, I have to check the years. He must have, I don't know if he went to service first. No, he must have, I don't know. If he went to service first or missionary school first, but that's where he met my mother. Then he went to Indianapolis and then started family here in Marion, Indiana.
Right. Again, this is always the challenge. You know, you've well established, you know, in a way, the timelines for your family itself in that sense. So now what you're really trying to do is provide the information or data to support it. And that's really what you're trying to do. The key first is develop a timeline, and, including locations, and then find the data to support it itself. The one thing that I'm not good at is talking about travel between the islands in the Caribbean. People migrated from one to the other, but I've not done that kind of research. There are research groups on those islands, the genealogy centers on those islands who can help you as far as that goes in that context.
Okay.
Like you do here.
Okay.
But thank you. See, are
Thank
there any
you.
questions? Are there any questions or comments or the like? I certainly want to thank everybody, for joining with us today. It's been an interesting journey for me as I formalize, my understanding of immigration, naturalization, and travel. I keep saying navigation because I'm a pilot. As far as that goes, I'm more to that kind of. But again, it's an interesting topic because it changed so much over the years. Again, what the rules are in that context. How the process works and where you can enter, a respective country. So I appreciate it. Are there any other questions here before we close? I guess none. I certainly want to say then thank you all, no matter where you are, for joining with us. It's been a pleasure to have you, with us today, and hopefully you'll join us again next time, October 16th, when we talk about cemetery research.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.